All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. And I'm happy to welcome back friend of the show, David Frum. He's a staff writer at The Atlantic and the author of Trumpocalypse. David Frum, great to see you.
Thank you.
So here we are. I don't know, what are we, month 2 now of the Trump administration? Yeah. It's been a wild ride. What so far would you say is the most consequential of all the many things we've seen?
Well, I've been thinking about that question because it doesn't have one answer. Maybe there are two. So there's consequential in what has the greatest impact on the lives of most Americans. And that is the reckless economic policy, the trade war, which is going to raise costs and push the economy into stagflation or even outright recession. But another way to think about the question, what is the most consequential, is what will be the hardest to undo? Because 20 years from now, no one will remember or care whether there was a recession in 2025. And I think many of the immigration outrages that the Trump administration is committing will end up with lawsuits and litigation and payouts to people improperly detained or improperly incarcerated. I think the hardest thing to get back will be America's credibility as a provider of security to allies. That's always going to be there. And a thing I've been paying attention to is the way foreign allies are beginning to rethink whether the United States can be trusted as a provider of weapons. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago in a NATO country. I was able to talk to the defense minister. They had a big defense program readying for new purchases, and they were turning against American equipment because they didn't trust America to be a safe security provider.
A lot to unpack there. Let's start with the economic side. You mentioned the term stagflation. Why don't you tell us what that is and how that's different than inflation?
Yeah. Okay, so this is where we oldsters can provide a service. So one of the things that people used to believe back in the ancient times, so the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, was there was inflation, there was recession, but not both. You wouldn't, if you had inflation, that meant you had an economic boom, maybe too big a boom. If you had a recession, at least the prices were stable. And that seemed to be true from the Great Depression until the 1970s. And then in the 1970s, there were these years from 1973 to 1982 where you got both. You got both very slow growth, often outright recession, and inflation. And so they coined the term stagflation to mean stagnation plus inflation. And that seems to be what we're heading toward, that the Trump tariffs are going to push up all kinds of prices in ways I think economic reporting doesn't help us with, because the reporting focuses on final goods like a tomato or an avocado, and not understanding that Trump is raising the price of things that go into other things. When you tariff aluminum, when you tariff glass, you push up the price of every other good in the economy almost. But we're going to have slower growth, the Federal Reserve says, down from in the last two Biden years, growth was in the high 2%, and we're now maybe going to have 1% for 2025, maybe less. And given that the population is growing, 1% growth isn't going to feel like anything to very many people.
And correct me if I'm wrong, David, but stagflation is it's like quicksand, right? Because some of the policies that you might use to solve a recession will worsen inflation. Some of the policies you might, or instruments you might use to solve inflation will worsen the recession.
When you're in a recession, one thing you can do is borrow money from the future and have government spending to rev up the economy. The problem is that will also accelerate inflation. Okay, so if you focus on the inflation piece, one thing you might do is raise interest rates to cool the inflation. But of course, that will make a weak economy even weaker. So as you say, the tools, the most obvious tools, become kind of unworkable. And that was the predicament policymakers had through the Nixon, Ford, and Carter years and into the Reagan years. We're seeing that now. The Federal Reserve was intending to cut interest rates in 2025, which would have been a big boost for home buyers and car buyers. And they're now, it looks like, not going to do any more rate cuts because they're so worried about Trump price inflation.
So I guess one question would be, does Trump, because if this happens, right, that's bad news for Trump, it's bad news for Republicans. If the economy, the thing that Trump ostensibly won on, if that starts to go south, that's bad news for Republicans. Does Trump walk back from the tariffs at that point, mitigating this problem? Or is there some weird end game where he firmly believes that he has to go? We have to go through. You got to go through the pain
Yeah.
before you get to the gain.
Well,
What's the deal?
imagine like being some kind of visiting missionary in the tent of Attila the Hun to say, Mr. Hun, you know, obviously there's a lot of short-term payoff from your strategy of raiding, killing, pillaging, raping, murdering, stealing. But, you know, if you really focused on education and creating a free trade zone here in the Han Empire, you could really boost long-term growth much more than you would get from, he'd look at you like a lunatic because pillaging is what he knows. So it is with Donald Trump. He doesn't believe that there can be an exchange where both people walk away a winner. He doesn't believe that. In any exchange, there's a winner and a loser. He's made that very clear. You have a deal, either you win. If the other guy is happy, that means you lost. So the whole logic, not only of free trade across borders, but of any kind of economic exchange within borders, baffles him. He's a predator. He thinks like a predator. So it's not impossible that, as happened in the first administration, that if things get bad enough, enough forces can sort of squash them. But bear in mind, the single most important person other than Trump in the administration, Elon Musk, is a maker of electric cars that are under intensifying threat from superior Chinese competition. So Musk's thinking is going to become increasingly protectionist too. His company is not going, with its hugely inflated stock price. I think even after the recent slide, it went to near $400 a share. Now it's in the 230, something like that. It's still trading at over 100 times earnings because of assumptions of future growth. But if you get into a Tesla, it's visibly a 10-year-old car. And there are better and newer models, and the Chinese models are cheaper too. And so you're going to have two people at the top who both fear and dread fair competition.
Yeah, I don't know not much about electric vehicles, but I recently heard that one of the problems is that Tesla. So the goal in terms of investment is, auto driving cars,
Yeah.
automatic, basically with driverless cars,
Yeah.
and that Tesla is only using cameras,
Yeah.
which are flawed when it comes to crashing into children and stuff, whereas maybe China is using cameras but other methods of sort of gauging their surroundings. Do you know anything about that?
Just the slightest piece, which is that Uber is doing a big experiment in the Bay Area with autonomous vehicles, and they're using Chinese cars, not Teslas. And I think what we've all gotten a glimpse of from Elon Musk is this is not a safety conscious individual. This is not a detail oriented guy. This is a guy who says, if you've got a server in the corner and you don't know what it does, unplug it and then you'll find out. His approach to the US government tells you something about his approach to auto safety. I'm not sure I'd want to get into an autonomous Tesla machine from a guy who fired all the nuclear safety workers without knowing what they did.
It just stuns me. It just stuns me that Trump and Musk have both become wildly successful by following almost all the wrong lessons of leadership and management.
Yeah.
And obviously, at some point, maybe it's the presidency when you hit the ceiling where there are, where it ceases to work. But I mean, it's just.
Well, Musk
It's
and Trump
got to be like a moral hazard to have them in these positions.
Well, Musk and Trump are very different individuals. I mean, Musk was obviously a super capable person at an earlier age, but with skills that were very good for solving certain kinds of problems, which is how do you get a new enterprise off and running, where he made decisions like, let's break rules and count on being billionaires by the time anybody enforces the rules on us, and then we'll be able to pay whatever the cost of the rule breaking was. He also has been taking a heavy drug regimen for a decade and a half. So you start out, he's now in a different situation. He's now got a different problem. He's not in the creative phase. He's in the phase where you have to take an electric vehicle, make it autonomous, and that requires precision engineering, zero tolerance for error, some understanding of the way human beings are. And that's a different thing from what made him so successful in the first place. Plus, there's the drug regimen. And now absolute power over the United States government with no responsibilities because he doesn't have to worry about losing. losing. No one's going to vote Elon Musk out of power. We can't do that. We can't even impeach him because he doesn't have any official role in the United States government. So he's got power without responsibility. In Donald Trump's case, there's more. He's just, he wrecked the legitimate family business early. And ever since then has been in one form or another of exploiting and taking advantage of people, at which he does have real skills. So that takes you a certain far, but is it a different sort of business problem than the Elon Musk business problem?
So back to the question about what has been the most consequential thing that's happened. So the economy, the tariffs are one part of it. Then you mentioned basically Donald Trump ending America's leadership role in the post-World War II, consensus world order. You are from Canada,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I have a
You
house there.
must have some. Is Canada now part of the axis of evil? I'm not sure.
So I spent a lot of time in Canada, very involved in Canadian life there. I have a house in Ontario. Um, uh, I think Americans tend to, when they think about Trump's threats against Canada, they think of that John Candy movie, Canadian Bacon, and they tend to treat it like a big gag. And what I wish people understood was if you went to the most conservative places in Canadian life, business leadership, people with senior positions in right of center political parties, they have been radicalized. That the people who were, Canada's never nationalist in the way Mexico's nationalist. There isn't the kind of anti-Americanism that is a real issue in Mexican political life. Canada's had a more benign history with the United States than Mexico has. So it's quite different. But there is a shock and a betrayal and a sense of threat. And it has, and particularly because the people who are now in this most senior leadership roles in Canadian life were people who came of age in the 1980s when there was a ferocious debate about entering into a free trade agreement with the United States in 1987, 88. And it was the most contentious election in Canada of my lifetime. And the argument of the best argument of the anti-free traders was, okay, maybe everything you free traders say is true today. But what guarantee do we have that the United States is not going to turn into a predatory, malignant, exploitive power that we can't do business with in the long run? And me, my friends, so many others said, that would never happen. That's impossible. They would never do that. This is America. This is the land of Reagan. They are trustworthy. They are good partners. And all of those assurances have now been discredited. And people take it quite personally because the people, again, in leadership roles were young people during that debate. And everyone's taking in mind, yeah, the United States is a predatory power, and that's not going to be forgotten.
Did you see there was a actress from Canada who was detained by ICE for something like 2 weeks in pretty harsh conditions, and she wrote about it. Obviously, we know the story about the alleged Venezuelan gang members who were sent to El Salvador.
Yeah.
And now it looks like some of them were not gang members, possibly. Right. And
I would have bet $100 against a box of donuts that at least one of them had to be innocent. Because when you sweep people up in that way and there's no hearing at all, you have in any law enforcement proceeding, when you have common names, you have coincidences of names. How many Juan Gonzalez's are there? And how do you know you've got the right Juan Gonzalez? Okay, maybe it's Juan middle name Gonzalez, but there are people where there's overlap. Yeah. How do you know? And it's the Trump administration. And clearly they've given a message to Trump. That's what that story about the Canadian actor shows. Take the gloves off. The usual decencies, the usual courtesies, the usual, just let's have some realistic estimate of danger. If you got this woman, you don't have to shackle her. She's obviously not going to attack anybody. She's not carrying a weapon. Even if you want to detain her and question her for a few hours, you don't have to deny her water.
Her biggest crime is what, overstaying a visa or something? I mean, it's not like she's a hardened criminal.
I think her biggest, not crime, but the reason there was a question mark about it was she was involved with a company that sold THC-infused water. And it's not impossible that she was carrying some samples of this across the border. I think that I don't know this for a fact, but this is my sense from reading the coverage, that she may have had, or they may have had something in her profile about her connection to the THC infused water company.
Wasn't that Russia's excuse basically for holding a WNBA
Yeah.
player?
Yeah.
I mean,
What a civilized country does is you say, we got somebody on a THC charge. Okay, maybe we have to hold them in a holding pen and ask them some questions, but they can have a glass of water. You don't have to shackle them. And it doesn't take 2 weeks to straighten it out, you know.
Is THC even illegal anymore in America? I feel like it's everywhere. You can't escape marijuana.
You're not allowed to bring it across the border. I cross the Canada-U.S. border a lot, and especially when you do it in a car, there's really one question each way. The Canadians want to know that you're not bringing guns into Canada, and the Americans want to know that you're not bringing THC into the United States. So just you're crossing the border, don't carry a weapon, don't carry THC.
Interesting. Fentanyl, borderline, but no THC.
The fentanyl, this is one of the things that makes the Canadians so crazy. So everyone in Canada understands the gang violence problem in Canada is entirely American exported. That fentanyl is coming from the United States into Canada. The weapons are coming from the United States into Canada. And to the extent that Canadian cities are less orderly than they were 15 years ago, and that's a very acute problem in Vancouver and a somewhat acute problem in Toronto, everyone knows the flow is from south to north. And there's a kind of, it's not just that the Americans are being bad neighbors, but they're being dishonest neighbors by pretending that this is a problem that flows from north to south.
I'm going to be interested. The Orioles, my baseball team, open in Toronto next week. And in Baltimore, when you sing the national anthem, they say, "Oh, say, can you see?" I'm wondering if the Star Spangled Banner will be booed in Toronto next week.
There were some initial, I think there was sort of a social conversation that's improper. That's not the right way to respond to this. So we'll see what happens. There may be some people who misbehave. I think generally there's a sense in Canada that booing the American national anthem is not right. At a sporting event, that's not the way to respond. But there is a lot of betrayal. It's not anger; it's a sense of betrayal and disillusionment, and it's strongest among the people who were the usual friends of the United States. And that's one of the reasons that this is having such a dramatic effect on the Canadian election, which is now likely to be at the end of April. In fact, it may be called between the time you and I record the show and you post it. So there's been this huge swing in Canadian public opinion. The Conservatives were 22 points ahead 6 months ago. Now the Liberals and the Conservatives are, with the Liberals under a new leader, the current Prime Minister Mark Carney. The Liberals are running neck and neck, and in some polls they're even ahead. And they've been in power for a decade. It hasn't been a good decade. There are a lot of critiques of liberal policy. That's why they were down 22 points. But the leader of the Conservative Party tried to activate the same social forces in Canada as Donald Trump tried to activate in the United States. So without being Trumpy himself, he used Trumpy language, and he has the disregard for the media. He would talk about the deep state. He borrowed Trumpy themes, and had Trump lost, that probably would not have been that expensive. But now that Trump's won, and now that he's turned his ire so much against Canada, the borrowing of Trumpy themes has been very damaging for. And Trump is trying to get ahead of that by saying, okay, now I really wish the Liberals would win. I get the endorsement. That's about Trump covering his ego and not wanting it to be seen that being associated with Trump can take you down 25 points in 6 months in a Canadian election.
Well, speaking of copying Trump, I mean, he has changed the political world, and I'm sure that everybody's going to emulate something about him, whether it's, populism or authoritarianism. And that's a real threat, is trickle down Trumpism. Democrats, what would you tell them if you were advising them? Is there anything they can, there's a story in Politico about how the Democrats are about to have their Tea Party moment, which kind of scares me, because that's how this started for us on the Republican side. It was the Tea Party led us ultimately to Trump. Is there a way to sort of channel that energy and that authenticity without going to the dark side?
The issues that will work for Democrats are the very different from the issues that will work for the lowercase d pro-democracy movement. So it's shocking and dangerous that the president is asserting the power to enter without a warrant the U.S. homes of people he alleges are gang members, and then to seize them, again, without any kind of showing of any kind of evidence, and put them on a plane and send them to a detention center in a third country that they had no contact with. This is all, the authors of the Bill of Rights would say this is exactly the kind of thing.
Were these, sorry to interrupt, David, but the Venezuelans specifically, were they rounded up or were they already being detained in a facility under?
Yes, I think you're quite right. Some were detained, but there have been more cases of roundups and people being seized. And there's the government has argued in court they do not need to have a warrant in order to enter the homes of people whom they regard as gang members. This is very dangerous. It's also probably quite popular. So a lot of the things that the activist base of the Democratic Party is most upset about are probably the things that he's doing that are most popular. And so from a capital D Democratic point of view, the issues that are going to most hurt Trump are the issues that are where weirdly he is most like a normal Republican. Canceling the 800 numbers on Social Security. I mean, that is an unbelievable move. Just like closing Social Security offices. I'm nearing Social Security age. I just got an email that says I'm no longer going to get a printed statement. All the statements are only online. Well, okay, that's no problem for me, but for an 87-year-old, that may be a very provocative thing, the end of the paper statement. And there's no gradual phase.
My mom, there are so many Americans who technology has just overtaken them.
Yeah.
And David, I heard you talking to Charlie Sykes, and you had a brilliant idea for what Joe Biden should have done. I hate to interrupt, but would you tell us that idea? Because I literally think this could win the election.
So I thought that Biden should have announced the creation of an 800 number called 1-800-USA-HELP. And anybody over age 65 could call this number for any kind of technical problem. Because with your older relatives, they'll call Apple Care because the Scrabble app isn't working. They want to know what's the 800 number for Facebook, and you have to tell them again and again there is no 800 number for Facebook. And so just staff it with underemployed Generation Z people. This could be like, you could do this for like some kind of technology boot camp. This is how you can have a summer, how you can pay your student debt while you're studying for technology school. You can do a summer, you can do a term working at the thing. You take questions, and you just, whatever the technology problem is, you're there to help. And you don't tell them that, look, that's an Apple problem. It doesn't work with your Facebook. You just get the pictures of the grandchildren uploaded to Facebook for them and tell them how to do it.
It's casework. It's constituent service.
Exactly. But they're doing so these Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid moves, the attack on veterans care, these are the things that are most lethal. But they're also the things that are least constitutionally dangerous. The American system of government can have, if there's a party that says, hey, we're overspending on Social Security provision, the farmers are getting too, that's absolutely a legitimate thing to contest in a democracy. That is not abnormal that Trump, it's stupid, but it's not abnormal that he would do it.
David, I just want to linger for a minute, though, on this idea you had. And I just tell you, from a personal standpoint, my mom, I'll give you just two quick analogies. Like, one, she had to change insurance, and now she thinks she may be having duplicative policies.
Yes.
And two different, she's paying double basically for the same coverage. She changed her phone. She went from having a landline to a cell phone or something. And then it messed up her cable TV because it was hooked into that. And this, I'm telling you, for 2 weeks, she was in almost a severe depression of being there's a sense of being overwhelmed. And then you don't understand things that are happening and you lose control. It is if you could solve that problem, wow.
We probably can't solve it, but what if that problem has occurred and it's literally the fault of the president of the United States? He personally messed up your cable TV.
Now he's gone too far.
But that's sort of what they're doing, right? That when they say you're going to need two-factor authentication to find out whether your whether your social security check is going to arrive on time. Um, what is my husband has died. I need to know my survivor benefit. Oh, you're going to have to you're going to have to use the app. Really? That's
wow.
Your message. And for Trump, when Trump's voters are rural, older, less educated, Trump is doing these things that are, if you're a 30-something in the Bay Area with, who lives on a cell phone, none of this is that threatening. But you're probably not a Trump voter. Elon Musk is engaged in the same way one of the way they're attacking the farmers. One of J.D. Vance's talking points in the 2024 campaign was the United States used to be an exporter of food, net exporter. And under Biden, it became a net importer. And that was true. Now, why did that happen? It's not because Americans are eating so many more mangoes and papayas than they used to eat. Yes, the dollar was strong in the Biden years, and so there was a little bit more importation of winter vegetables from Mexico. Somewhat more avocado, somewhat more lettuce, somewhat more tomatoes, somewhat. But the thing that would take the United States from its massive surplus in farm products to its deficit was that Trump gave away the soybean market. Before 2017, the United States was the largest exporter of soybeans in the world. When Trump started his trade war with China, their retaliation was to redirect their soybean purchases from the United States to Brazil, which is now the largest soybean producer and exporter. And the biggest soybean market is gone forever. And Trump began his second presidency by saying, what we did to soybeans, caution to other growers of grain, you're going to need to find domestic markets. Well, how do you sell more wheat? How do you sell more wheat inside the United States? Americans are not going to eat more bread. They're eating as much bread as they want to eat.
We're already pretty maxed out on that. Yeah.
Yeah. And what is also happening, so he's disrupting the farm economy in all kinds of ways. I mean, I was talking to someone in the beer industry, and they are just aghast because what are the two biggest costs in beer? The aluminum can it comes in, and the barley it's made out of, both of which are internationally. Most of the aluminum in the United States comes from Canada. The United States produces something like 16% of its own aluminum. So you put a tariff on it, aluminum is going to become very, very much more expensive. And of course, barley tends to come from Canada too, because barley is a more northerly product. And American farmers anyway have switched from growing those kinds of secondary grains to growing corn that you can turn into synfuels and soybeans, which are increasingly turned into synfuels at greater cost because the United States has lost the Chinese market. So you attack the elderly, you attack the farmers. Oh, you're closing rural post offices. But all of this, as politically ludicrous as it is not actually dangerous to American society. It's just dangerous to the party fool enough to do it. Things that are dangerous to American society are things that may be more popular. And to your question about what the Democrats need to do, they need to not be driven by their base into saying, we're going to defend our need to defend the most marginalized people in society means we are going to take up the banner of keeping trans people in girls' sports. That's probably the single most popular thing Donald Trump has done.
It's like an 80-20.
Yeah. It seems like a crazy fight to have, but there are people in the Democratic Party who are going to be mad at Chuck Schumer unless he gives them that fight.
A lot to unpack here. One thing, going back to Donald Trump's, it sounds like Biden got blamed for the soybeans, not Trump. And even when Trump does things, so there was a guy, a Trump voter whose wife is detained by ICE. He still supports Trump.
Yeah.
There was a measles outbreak, in Texas, and one of the families who lost a child to measles is still recommending do not get your child vaccinated.
Yeah.
And so it makes me wonder to what degree Trump voters are even persuaded when they're personally hurt by his policies, if they even know.
This is a variant of a question we've been debating for a long time, which is, what does it take to change the minds of the Trump base? To which my answer is always, the reason they're called the base is because nothing will change their minds. And I just want to remind you that in 1932, the year of the Great Depression, when Americans were literally going hungry, Herbert Hoover still got what, 38% of the vote? Because there are people who said, yeah, I don't love the Depression. Okay, I don't love the Depression, but I cannot get past the fact that the Democrats are on the wrong side of the Civil War. Plus, they want to sell alcohol in saloons. And my top voting issues are punishing the Democrats for the Civil War and keeping alcohol out of saloons. And the Depression, that's issue number 3 for me. And a third of the country.
Yeah.
That didn't save Hoover, however. He kept his base, but he still lost. So you don't lose elections because you lose your base. You lose elections because you lose at the margin. So someone who is so fanatically committed to his delusionary vision of the world, so that he would sacrifice his own child by refusing a measles, that person is probably not very open to persuasion. But there are lots of other people, and this is the thing that the Democrats have to understand as they just make the decision to ignore their Tea Party, pseudo Tea Party base. The things that the Democratic left wants to talk about, transgender rights, Gaza, are poison. Stay away from them. The Democratic left is tiny, and they love losing. They love losing. It's their favorite thing. And their vision, actually, they prefer Trump because they think, okay, if we have a Trump victory, we're that much step closer to our glorious socialist revolution. Whereas if we just have boring technocratic liberalism in power, we're pushed back from our glorious socialist revolution.
I think that all sounds great. And that's why you get David Frum on the podcast. That Herbert Hoover analogy hits home the point, which is, yeah, the base, there's going to be 30% that will not be persuaded. But there are people, the swing voters, that decide elections. And if you mess up their cable TV, then it's game over for you, I think.
Yes.
And let's just, the larger point I think we're making here was the most, probably the most important thing to you and me, David, is the threat that Trump potentially poses to liberal democracy, to the sense that America is a shining city on a hill, a beacon of hope, and also our freedoms here, due process, all of that stuff you and I believe is the most important, but probably not the way you win an election.
Yeah.
If you actually want to persuade those undecided or those swing voters, you probably don't talk as much about liberal democracy and the American-led global, world order or consensus. What you talk about is
you can make those issues comprehensible to people. One way to do it is to say, Trump is all the time talking about how expensive Ukraine is. So all U.S. aid to Ukraine since February 22 totals something like $130 billion. About half of that was delivered in the form of old, used military equipment, which the Ukrainians repurposed. So the cash portion is only about half. And that the cash is not just cash that was given to the Ukrainians, but the cash, you take an old weapon system. Okay, that's basically free. You've already paid for it, but it costs to put it in a box, put it on a ship, move the ship, uncrate it, train people how to use it. That costs folding money. So the folding money component is probably about half the $130 billion. How much is half of $130 billion? Let's put that in comparison. Trump's strategic crypto concept, which is basically a cash payout to his least attractive supporters, least deserving, least attractive, most wealthy supporters. The bill in the Senate that talks about establishing a Bitcoin reserve talks about buying 1 million units of Bitcoin over 5 years. And at the peak, at the price of, if the United States were to do it, we've already seen when people believe the United States might do it, Bitcoin goes to $90 or $100, $90,000 or $100,000. So they're talking spending $100 billion of taxpayer folding money to bail out billionaires who bet on crypto.
Mm-hmm.
That, when Trump talks about the cost of you can drive that point home. I mean, I think the Bitcoin reserve will matter. And if there aren't commercials of the $750 million Secretary of the Treasury saying, let them eat flat screen TVs, cheap goods are not important. I can afford I have 87 flat screens. I don't know what they cost. You have just one, you should, if I can have 87 and not notice the price, you should be able to have one and not notice the price either. And what, you're telling me I shouldn't care what my TV costs?
There's definitely sound bites out there, right? Trump talking about there's going to be some disruption. Trump officials talking about, well, the American dream is not really about
Lutnick, the
consumer
Secretary of Commerce,
goods.
saying, if we have a recession for the tariffs, it will be worth it.
Yeah, you got to have no pain, no gain, right?
No, you see the ad, the photograph of people at the unemployment office, and the caption, "It'll be worth it."
There you go. All right, before I get you out of here, I think this may be our last question, depending how things go. But you mentioned the trans athlete issue, which I think Trump is definitely on the right side politically of, to be sure. Um, I'm not a big fan of the DEI stuff, especially when taken to its extremes. Trump can do some good stuff and some things that are popular. I wanted to ask you specifically about the Houthis.
Yeah.
And if you believe that Trump, what he's doing there, what he did there, is a sign of a more robust president as opposed to what Joe Biden did.
Well, there are times when it's the right thing to do is be a big dumb bully whacking at moles with your club. And I used to say this to the Biden people about Ukraine, that where they were so busy trying to deliver precisely the level of capacity that Ukraine needed, and neither more nor less. And I say, you guys are too smart. Just send them everything. If they end up with too much, they end up with too much. Just send them everything. Get the war over with as fast as possible. Just be stupider. Don't be so smart. But the Houthi thing is an example. Yeah, okay, there's a part of me that says, yeah, pirates menace commerce, sink their boats, crush their... But when the central economic of your idea of your administration is international trade is bad, and we need less of it, how does this make any sense from Trump's point of view? Why is he doing this? The Houthis are doing exactly what the tariffs do, making it more difficult to trade. Why don't you say, you know what? They're making consumer goods more expensive. That's a good thing. They're making it harder to ship things, and they're hurting our allies more than they hurt the United States, because the United States ships relatively few things past the Horn of Africa. They're hurting European-Chinese trade. That's good. We want to see less trade. Trade is bad, as Trump famously wrote in the notes of his speech. So I applaud that when force is used, it should be used decisively. But be it understood that Trump, when he uses force, is acting as irrationally and dangerously and destructively as when he doesn't use force. And if you were to say, what is the higher priority, stopping the Houthis or saving Ukraine? The latter is obviously much more important to U.S. interests, to world peace and stability. And so I don't understand the program where you say we're having direct U.S. military intervention against the Houthis and we are abandoning Ukraine to the Russians. How does that make any sense? Especially for an administration that thinks trade is bad.
I was afraid you were going to say, I applaud the Houthis.
No, look, I think, I'm a George W. Bush alumnus. When enemies of America appear, smite them, but smite them intelligently, smite them with allies, smite them in service of larger strategic goals. And you can't smite all of them. So choose your targets for smiting in some strategic way, and getting to a successful conclusion of the Ukraine war is priority one. Deterring Taiwan, or maybe deterring China from attacking Taiwan is priority one, and a successful conclusion to the Ukraine war is important because it serves priority one. But all of this should be in service of a larger architecture of American security, of international peace, of international commerce. If you don't believe in international peace and commerce, why are the Houthis bad? They are doing more of the good work of that the Trump tariffs want to do, of stopping trade, because trade is bad.
David Frum, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.